The first lie my wife told about me fit neatly inside a doctor's waiting room. "He's been forgetting things," Claire said. She said it softly, with one hand resting on my shoulder as though tenderness and testimony were the same thing. We were sitting under bad fluorescent light in a private clinic on Monument Avenue after I had woken on the floor of my own office with a split lip, a bruised cheekbone, and a nurse from next door pressing gauze into my hand. It had not been dramatic. No ambulance, no collapse in public. Just a moment of darkness after 3 bad weeks, too much coffee, too little sleep, and a grief I had been carrying badly for longer than I cared to admit. "He's under a lot of pressure," she told the neurologist. "The theater, the restoration, his mother's estate. It's all been too much. He's been mixing things up lately." I turned and looked at her. Not because I was confused, because I was trying to understand why her voice sounded rehearsed. The doctor nodded the way men nod when a wife gives them a usable story about a husband. Stress, exhaustion, maybe dehydration. "Nothing catastrophic," he said. "Rest, observation, reduce hours." That was in March. By July, my wife was trying to remove me from the board of my own theater. By September, she had convinced my oldest friend to help her do it. And by October, on the night of our annual Founders Gala, they were both standing beneath my mother's chandelier, preparing to announce a future that did not include me. My name is Matthew Rowan. I am 52 years old. I own, or owned, depending on who was talking that week, the Bellwether Theater in Richmond, Virginia. It is not a grand place by metropolitan standards. It seats 406 if you count the awkward corner seats under the west balcony that people always complain about and then pretend made the evening charming. The facade is pale brick with a cracked blue marquee my mother refused to replace because, in her words, "If you take out every original flaw, all you'll have left is a bank branch pretending to be history." Inside, the Bellwether smells like dust, velvet, old wiring, floor polish, and that faint metallic heat projectors used to leave in the booth after a late screening. The ceiling is painted midnight blue with small gold stars, most of them retouched badly in the 70s. The seats are narrow. The lobby is too small. The men's room on the second floor always needs something. I have loved it without moderation for most of my life. My grandfather opened the theater in 1938. My father ran it like a house of worship and a side hustle at the same time. My mother saved it twice. The first time was in 1984, when multiplexes bled the neighborhood and my father almost sold to a furniture chain. The second was in 2009, after he died and creditors started speaking to me in that gentle managerial tone men use when they think you might surrender if they sound sympathetic enough. I did not surrender. My mother didn't either. We turned the Bellwether into something the city had nearly forgotten how to want. A repertory house, a revival theater, a place for old film, live scores, festival weekends, children's matinees, uncomfortable documentaries, and the sort of audiences who still believed darkness and silence could improve a person if applied properly. Claire came into that life 13 years ago. She was not from theater. She was from development, fundraising, donor relations, all the bright, polished corners of culture that make institutions possible and slightly false at the same time. She knew how to seat a judge next to the right widow, how to get another 10,000 out of a man who had arrived certain he was only good for 3, how to use words like stewardship, community, and legacy without sounding like a brochure. I loved her because she steadied the parts of my life that still moved too much. She loved me, I think, because I gave her something harder than affection and more permanent than romance. I gave her an old building full of meaning and need. At the time, I did not understand that some people are drawn less to love than to leverage. Our daughter, Sophie, was not ours by blood. Claire had her from her first marriage, a brief legal disaster she almost never discussed. Sophie was 12 when I married Claire, all elbows and suspicion, dark-haired, furious at almost everything, especially the idea that another man might think he had any authority in her life. I never tried to be her father. That was why, eventually, she trusted me like one. She grew up in the theater, did homework in the projection booth, fell asleep on coats in the green room during late screenings, learned to splice 16mm before she learned to parallel park. By 26, she was living in Brooklyn, cutting documentary films and calling me every Sunday whether she had time or not. If the bellwether had one bloodline left in it that I believed in more than my own, it was Sophie. The friend who betrayed me was named Daniel Cross. Everyone called him Danny except me. I had known him since we were 10 years old and stole cigarettes from his older brother and threw up behind St. Mark's because neither of us understood pacing. He grew up into a lawyer in expensive ties and inherited caution. I grew up into a man who spent too much of his life arguing about projectors and rights clearances and whether audiences deserved proper sound levels. We stayed friends because long familiarity makes its own stubborn country. When my father died, Danny helped me untangle the estate. When the city nearly condemned the bellwether over wiring issues, he knew which deputy planner needed his ego fed before his signature moved. When Claire and I married, Danny stood beside me in the old Presbyterian church on Hanover Street with his hands folded and tears in his eyes, looking absurdly solemn for a man who had once been arrested with me for climbing the gates at Maymont after midnight. If you had asked me 3 years ago which betrayal I was less likely to survive, my wife or my oldest friend, I would have said wife. I would have been wrong. The first months after the clinic visit were strange in quiet ways. Staff became careful around me, not disrespectful, worse, gentle, the sort of gentle reserved for people half broken or almost embarrassing. Our box office manager began repeating small things as if I might forget them. A donor asked whether I was still feeling sharp enough for Gala season. One of the union projectionists patted my shoulder when I snapped at a volunteer and said, "Long week, boss," in the tone people use when granting mercy to a man already being privately discussed. It took me longer than it should have to understand that I was not imagining it. Someone had adjusted the room around me. Claire did it first in private. "You've seemed off," she said one morning while slicing grapefruit with precise, almost surgical attention. "You lose your temper faster. You leave papers everywhere. You've repeated yourself a few times." Everyone repeats themselves. Not like this. I looked at her over my coffee. Like what? She paused, not because she was unsure, because she was choosing. Like you're tired in ways you don't notice. If this had happened 10 years earlier, I might have apologized. Marriage teaches men to mistake narrative for intimacy if it comes from the right mouth. Instead, I said, "You've become very interested in describing me lately." She gave me that small, hurt look women perfect early and deploy selectively. "I'm worried," she said. Worried. Another useful word. The next person to use it was Danny. He came by the office on a Thursday afternoon in late April, closed my door behind him, and sat opposite me without being asked. "How are you really?" he said. "I was signing festival contracts. I kept signing." "Busy." "You know that's not what I mean." I put the pen down. "What exactly do you think you mean?" He leaned back. "Claire says you're not sleeping. She says you nearly signed the wrong insurance rider last week." I stared at him. "Claire says a lot of things." "She's worried." There it was again. Worried. "You came here as my friend or my monitor?" He had the decency to wince. "Don't make this ugly." That sentence, more than anything else, told me ugliness was already underway, and I had only just arrived late to it. The business of the theater gave them cover. That was the elegant part. We were in the middle of the largest capital campaign since 2009. Roof repairs, updated HVAC, lobby restoration, digital archival work, accessibility upgrades. Enough moving pieces that any disagreement could be labeled stress. Enough money changing hands that small irregularities disappeared inside the noise. I began noticing them in May. a lighting consultancy I had not approved, a donor dinner at a club I would never have chosen, invoices for branding review tied to a firm in Charlotte, nothing individually scandalous, wrong in aggregate. When I asked Claire about the branding invoice, she said, "You approved this at the March development meeting." I wasn't at the March development meeting. You were on Zoom for part of it. I was in the clinic with a concussion. She looked at me then, not startled, interested, almost as if she had forgotten, for one brief second, that the lie should at least nod toward plausibility. Then she smiled, tiredly. Then I must have remembered it wrong. Must have. Remembered. Wrong. Every sentence, if you listened closely enough, was already building a case file. The first time I saw her with Danny, really saw them, it was not because they were careless enough to kiss. It was because of a silence. There is a kind of silence between two people that only arrives after they have stopped editing themselves for each other. I walked into the upstairs office one evening in early June, looking for the 1938 charter documents we planned to display at the Founders' Gala. Claire and Danny were standing near the window. Nothing dramatic, no embrace, no hands, just too close, with too much quiet already arranged around them. They stepped apart a second too late. Claire spoke first. "Matt." My own name in my own office sounded like something she had borrowed for the occasion. I looked from her to Danny, and then to the documents on the desk between them. A draft presentation deck. Not mine. Not even hers alone. Co-branded with the logo of a hospitality group out of Atlanta, I had rejected the previous winter when they asked whether the Bellwether had boutique conversion potential. I said nothing. That was the first act of revenge. Silence. Not because I was stunned, because once the truth was visible, I wanted the rest of it. All of it. Every inch. Every paper. Every hand reaching where it should not. That night, after Claire fell asleep beside me with one arm flung over the duvet as though innocence were a posture, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan and made a list in my head. Lawyer, forensic audit, board records, trust papers, Sophie. That last one hurt most because involving her would make the whole thing real in a way private pain still was not. The next morning I called Evelyn Price, 72, litigator, board member once, friend of my mother's before she became mine. She had the face of a woman who had spent 40 years watching rich men lose the ability to lie once enough paper appeared between them. When I told her I needed discretion and speed, she said, "How married is the problem?" I laughed once without humor. "More than one way." "Good," she said. "That usually gives us options." She put me in touch with a forensic accountant named Neil Bramford and told me not to confront anyone until she said so. Neil found the money trail faster than I expected. There was a company called Cross Meridian Arts Consulting, Danny's surname. Of course, Cross Meridian had billed the Bellwether $163,000 over 9 months for strategic planning, transition advisory, brand positioning, and executive continuity work. Claire had approved every payment. There were also private emails, not love letters. That would have been easier. No, these were operational, intimate in a far uglier way. He's getting more suspicious. His hand was shaking at the donor lunch. "We need the board aligned before October. If he resists, we use the health narrative and force interim structure." The health narrative. That was the phrase. Not concern, not help, not even decline. Narrative. I read that word 3 times before setting the pages down. Evelyn watched my face across her office and said nothing. Finally, I asked, "What does interim structure mean?" She slid another document toward me. Draft board minutes. In the event of temporary incapacity, the executive director, Claire, would assume operational control, with board chair Daniel Cross overseeing financial transition and strategic partnership conversations. The theater would then enter an exploratory alliance with the Atlanta Hotel Group under heritage preservation language that sounded philanthropic enough to fool anyone who only skimmed. They were going to say I was unstable, I said. They were going to say they were helping, Evelyn replied. That is the difference between amateurs and professionals. Amateurs steal, professionals reframe. There was one problem with their elegant future. My mother, or rather, the version of my mother that still existed in the legal machinery of the bellwether. After my father's death, when the theater nearly went under, she rewrote everything. Quietly. No family drama, no speeches. She simply changed the structure and told only Evelyn, because my mother believed most men talked too much when frightened and too little when in love. The bellwether's real assets were not the building, though people always assumed that. The real assets were the archival rights, the repertory licenses, the collection, the name, the programming trust, and the donor endowment attached to the house's nonprofit arm. Those rights were locked into a founder's trust and could not be transferred, diluted, or merged into any outside hospitality entity without approval from 3 signatories. Me, Evelyn, and Sophie, once she turned 25. Sophie had turned 25 the year before. Claire did not know. Danny certainly didn't. For the first time since March, I felt something like calm, not triumph, something quieter. My mother had anticipated exactly the sort of people who speak about legacy while pricing your exit. I called Sophie that night. She answered on the second ring from Brooklyn, wind noise moving around her voice. What's wrong? I smiled despite myself. Why assume something is wrong? Because you never call me on Thursday. Thursday is your terrible frozen dumpling night. That hurt and helped at the same time. I need you in Richmond. A pause. How bad? Bad enough. She did not ask a second question. I'll be there tomorrow. I picked her up at the station Friday afternoon. She had a black duffel bag, a laptop case, and the same look on her face she used to wear before exams she knew she would pass, but intended to resent on principle. She got in the car, looked at me once, and said, "Did she do something awful, or just ordinary awful?" That was the moment I knew Claire had been underestimating more than one person. I told Sophie everything on the drive, not the intimate details. Enough. Claire and Danny, the payments, the board language, the health narrative, the hotel group, the trust. She said nothing until we were almost home. Then she asked, "Do you want me angry or useful?" That was Claire's daughter speaking. Maybe mine too by then. "Useful," I said. "Good," she replied. "I'm already angry." The next month was a lesson in the uses of patience. That was the second act of revenge, permission. I let them keep arranging the gala. Claire expanded the guest list. Danny revised the speech order. The Atlanta men booked train tickets, and one of them sent a note about being excited to witness the transition vision in person. I answered that note myself, warmly. Sophie moved into the apartment above the projection booth to work on an archival montage for the centennial screening. That part was true. She built something for me in those weeks, though not what Claire thought. It began as film, old photographs, my grandfather in shirt sleeves beneath the unfinished marquee, my father threading a projector, my mother standing on the lobby ladder with a paint roller in 1984 after the flood ruined the plaster and the insurance company tried to underpay her by enough to kill the theater politely. Then Sophie added other things, scans of board minutes, wire transfers, email excerpts, dates, nothing melodramatic, no red circles, no villain music, just evidence, clean and undeniable, arranged with the same ruthless grace Claire had spent years praising in good editing. At the end, Sophie found something I did not know we still had. An old interview tape from 2011, recorded by a local arts reporter after my mother saved the bellwether the second time. The audio was rough, but her voice came through clearly enough. If anybody tells you this place is only real estate, she said on the tape, amused and tired at once, it means they've already decided to sell something they didn't build. When Sophie played that line for me in the booth one evening, I had to sit down. She'd like this, Sophie said. No, I said after a moment. She'd hate the audience and approve the timing. That made Sophie smile. The Founders' Gala arrived warm for October, one of those strange Virginia evenings when the air feels undecided and every old house in the fan glows like it is remembering itself. The bellwether looked beautiful. That made me angrier than anything else, because beauty was always Claire's strongest accomplice. She understood how to make people less skeptical by giving them something lovely to stand inside. The lobby was dressed in amber light, champagne on silver trays, string quartet under the west stair, posters from our first 50 years framed along the hall. Upstairs, in the house itself, the seats glowed blue under low light, and the stars in the ceiling looked almost intentional again. People came, donors, curators, bankers, city council members, 2 judges, a critic from Washington, old Richmond money with names tied to hospitals and bad portraits. And there, smiling as though history had invited them personally, the 3 men from Atlanta who believed they were about to witness my retirement, dressed as civic transition. Claire wore midnight silk. Danny wore a black tuxedo and the look of a man already congratulating himself in the mirror. At one point, I watched them from the back of the lobby as they spoke with the Atlanta group beneath my mother's photograph. Claire had one hand on Danny's forearm while he explained something with his other hand. They looked polished, coordinated, certain. For a moment, I almost pitied them. Then Danny laughed at something one of the hotel men said, and Claire tilted her head just slightly toward him, intimate in a way no room should ever have rewarded. The pity passed. The evening moved on cue. Welcome remarks, auction, short archival reel, dinner in the lobby and mezzanine. Then at 9:15, the audience moved into the house for the final portion of the gala. Claire stood on stage first. The spotlight was warm. She thanked donors, staff, family, the city. She spoke about my mother. She did it well enough that 2 people in the 3rd row cried. Then she shifted. Anyone trained in rooms like that could hear the gear change. The bellwether, she said, has always survived because the people who loved it had the courage to let it evolve. A few nods. A few hands folded more carefully. Tonight, she continued, we honor not only its past, but its future. There it was, the word, future. I looked at Sophie in the projection booth window. She didn't move. Good, Claire went on. For months, our board has been in conversation about ensuring that the bellwether remains vital, protected, and financially sustainable for generations to come. Those conversations have required difficult honesty, especially around the health and capacity of those who have carried this institution for so long. A murmur now. Small. Enough. Then she said my name. Not husband, not partner. My name. And I knew the knife had finally come all the way out. She invited Danny to the stage. He stepped into the second light as smoothly as a man accepting an award. He spoke about stewardship. He spoke about temporary strain. He spoke about my immense contribution and the need to honor Matthew by lightening the burden he should never have had to carry alone. And then he said the sentence I had been waiting for. With Matthew's best interests in mind, and with unanimous board support, we're proud to announce a new strategic partnership that will secure the bellwether's future beyond any one individual. There was applause. Not much, but enough. Just enough for them to believe they had the room. That was when I stood. Not quickly. I was done with quickness by then. The applause faltered because even before facts arrive, people can feel a reversal if they have lived long enough near money. I walked to the side aisle, then down toward the stage. Claire saw me first. I watched the exact moment she understood there was a script in the room she had not written. "Matthew," she said, still smiling for the audience, "there's no need." "There is," I said. My voice carried farther than hers because it had less to hide. Danny tried to intercept me at the stage steps. I took the microphone from his hand before he fully understood I was reaching for it. "Sit down," I said to him quietly. And because public confidence is a costume with terrible seams, he did. I looked out at the house, at the donors, the hotel men, the staff, the old regulars who had come to every Founders Night since 2010. And I said, "You've just heard a very polished description of concern. So before we continue, I think you should see what concern looked like in writing." Then I nodded once toward the booth. The screen behind me came alive. Not film. Not yet. First came the documents. Wire transfers from bellwether accounts to Cross Meridian. Board minutes drafted before discussion ever happened. Internal emails about the health narrative. The room went absolutely still. No music, no coughs, no shifting programs. Only the hum of projector machinery and the soft mechanical certainty of truth once it has light behind it. I did not narrate every slide. I only gave the audience enough to understand the shape. "Those transfers," I said, "were approved by my wife and routed to my oldest friend. Those documents were prepared to remove me from operational control under the language of fatigue and concern. The partnership being announced tonight was negotiated while funds were being stolen from the theater in support of my own replacement." Claire had gone white. Danny was staring at the screen like a man reading his obituary and finding the prose unfairly accurate. Then the audio played. My mother's voice. Rough from age. Amused. Clear. "If anybody tells you this place is only real estate, it means they've already decided to sell something they didn't build." Something broke in the room then. Not literally. Something in the mood. The entire evening tilted from event into witness. I turned away from the screen and back toward the audience. "One more thing," I said. Evelyn rose in the aisle. The old woman could have walked on stage naked holding a sword and less perfectly commanded attention. "The Bellwether's Founder Trust prohibits any transfer of naming rights, archives, programming control, or structural conversion without 3 approvals," she said. "Mine, Matthew Rowan's, and Sophie Rowan's." Sophie stepped into the booth window then, visible in the lit rectangle above the audience. That mattered. Not for legal reasons. For blood. For continuity, the real way, not Claire's way. "She does not consent," Evelyn said. I spoke into the silence. "Nor do I." No one applauded this time. They didn't need to. Applause would have made it spectacle. The silence was far more expensive. I turned toward Claire and Danny. Not angrily. That would have given them drama to hide inside. I said, quietly enough that the front rows heard and the rest leaned in, "You were never preserving the future. You were monetizing my absence." Claire closed her eyes. Danny looked down at his own shoes. The Atlanta men stood up and left before anyone formally dismissed them. That pleased me more than it should have. The rest ended slowly. Staff turned up the house lights. People remained seated because no one was sure whether leaving too fast would look cowardly or wise. Evelyn spoke privately with the judges and the banker. Claire tried once to take the microphone back. Sophie cut sound from the booth before she reached it. I have never loved that girl more. When the room had thinned enough to breathe again, Claire found me backstage. Not in tears. That would have been easier. Just very tired. "Was that necessary?" she asked. "Yes." "You humiliated me." "No," I said. "I revealed you." That landed. She looked at the floor for a moment. Then she said the saddest sentence of the night. "I did love you." I believed her. That was the trouble with Claire. Truth and betrayal always lived too close together in her. She was capable of both at the same hour and expected the nearness to be understood as complexity instead of choice. "I know," I said. She looked up sharply, maybe expecting hatred and finding something worse: accuracy. "And you still did it," I said. She did not argue. Danny never came backstage. He sent word through one of the board volunteers that he wanted to speak privately, man to man. I told Evelyn. She smiled for the first time that evening and said, "There is no man-to-man left in him now." The board met formally the next morning. Claire was removed. Danny resigned before he could be. Civil action began Monday. Criminal referrals came later and more quietly than people imagine. Most white-collar disgrace arrives in binders, not sirens. The money was partially recovered. Not all. Enough. The hotel group issued a statement about withdrawing from exploratory conversations. Donors who had nearly vanished in spring returned in winter with checks and careful apologies, phrased as if they had almost made a tax error rather than nearly applauded my professional burial. The theater survived. That part matters more than anything else. Not elegantly, not romantically. We cut expenses, rebuilt trust, reduced the number of events, raised prices slightly, let 2 board seats go vacant rather than fill them quickly with well-dressed idiots. Sophie moved back for a year. She took over the archives first, then programming support, then more than that without either of us naming it too soon. Watching her walk the mezzanine with a clipboard and my mother's focus in her face, I sometimes felt grief and pride arrive so close together they became almost indistinguishable. Claire moved to Washington. Consulting, I heard. Danny took a position in Charlotte that sounded impressive and meant less than the title suggested. He wrote me one letter, 3 pages, mostly about pressure, mistakes, loneliness, blurred lines, how things get away from people. I read it once, then filed it under correspondence, because even betrayal deserves proper storage if it is going to remain in the building. A year later, on Founders' Night again, we reopened the restored North Lobby. Nothing grand, just honest work completed properly. Fresh plaster, better lamps, original tile uncovered beneath bad 70s carpet. Sophie insisted on keeping one cracked piece in the threshold because, in her words, a place with no visible scar is lying. She was right. That night, after the screening, we stood alone in the house with the stars glowing above us and the last of the staff clearing glasses in the lobby. Sophie sat on the edge of the stage and said, "Do you feel better? Not vindicated? Not relieved? Better." I thought about it. Then I said, "No." She nodded, unsurprised. "Do you?" She considered. "Yes," she said. "A little." "Why?" "Because they didn't get to narrate the ending." That was so exactly the right sentence I laughed out loud. Then I sat beside her in the dark and looked out at the empty seats. Some men want revenge because they still love too much. Some because they hate too cleanly. That was never quite it for me. What I wanted in the end was possession of the story. Not the story Claire told doctors with her hand on my shoulder. Not the story Danny told investors about stewardship and transition. Mine. The plain one. I was not fragile. I was not fading. I was not a relic to be managed gently into decorative irrelevance. I was simply standing in a room full of people who had mistaken their access for authority. That happens. It happens in marriages, in businesses, in families. It happens anytime people begin discussing your best interests before confirming whether you are still capable of speaking them yourself. The bellwether is still here. That is my ending. Not dramatic justice, not ruined enemies. Just the building, the stars, the screen. A daughter in the booth who knows how to cut lies cleanly when needed. And an old house that survived being renamed in other people's mouths because at the last possible moment I was still standing in it when the lights came up.